Hi, I'm Tony Northrup and this is my free overview for how to use your new Canon T6s. I'm going to cover all the ins and outs of the Canon. There's a table of contents in the description in case you know the basic stuff and you want to jump to the more advanced stuff, or if you want to know specifically how to, say, turn on back button focus, jump right down into that table of contents. We're going to be covering all the nitty-gritty physical parts, just kind of assuming this is your very first camera. Up first, if you want to be able to take that lens on and off, there's a button here to the left of the lens. You push that in, and then taking your lens off, you turn it counterclockwise, and it should slide off. When you want to put it back on, line up the white dot here with the white dot here. Now, if you're using a full frame lens, you'll line up a red dot to the red dot. Either way, you line it up, it should slide in, and then you turn it clockwise until it clicks. Then I always wiggle it back and forth a little, make sure it's on there nice and solid. The battery compartment is located underneath. Slide this switch forward and it should pop open. Then pull that gray switch down and the battery will pop out a little bit. There you go. You cannot charge the camera through USB. You have to use the external battery charger. Just push this back in. Make sure the metal contacts here are facing the back of the camera. Push that in all the way until it clicks. Then shut that door. One more compartment here is the memory card slot. Pull it forward and then push it open like this and you'll see a slot for an SD card. Push it in and it will pop out like that. Basically any SD card will work. If you're shooting action and sports, you might consider getting one of the faster SD cards, one of the ones that has like a high number of megabytes per second write speed. That's what you're going to care about. But for most of us, you can get any old cheap SD card. I use these 128 gigabyte SD cards all the time. They go for like $70 or so, but because they're so big, you can hold thousands and thousands of pictures. So I like to get those. And then if I'm on vacation for a week, I never have to worry about filling the card up. It works just great. And you should never run into any kind of problems, even if you're shooting RAW. There are a few ports over here on the left side of the camera that you should know about. On the forward port here, this flips right open. You'll see two openings. The mic port here below, if you're shooting video, the camera has an on-camera mic, but it will sound bad. It will just always sound tinny and kind of terrible. You can get much better sound by hooking up an external mic. If you want to trigger the camera remotely or configure it for a timer as you would for night photography, you'll use the port above it right there. Just make sure you get a timer or remote shutter trigger that's compatible with the T6s. It will be compatible with the earlier cameras in the same series, like the Canon T3, T3i, T5, etc. There's another port here on the back. Open this up and you'll see two openings. The bottom one is a mini HDMI port. You can use this to connect it up to a television if you wanted to play back your pictures while you're on vacation and see it on a big screen. Or, in theory, you could hook it up to an external HDMI recorder and record video in higher quality if you're using it for a high-quality video camera. The upper port there is labeled a digital AV port, but basically it's a USB port. So you'll connect a USB connector in there. You can then use that USB connector to control the camera if you need to, or most of the time you'll just be using it to offload pictures. But me personally, I prefer to use a USB 3 memory card reader, faster memory card reader, and just put the SD card right in that memory card reader. CF cards sometimes wear out when you take them in and out a lot. SD cards, I haven't had any problems with that, so I wouldn't hesitate just to use a memory card reader. Let's move on to actually taking a picture, the good stuff, right? Your first step, of course, to turn the camera on. There's a switch over here on the left to switch it from off to on. Now, when you get the camera, the way it's set up by default, it will autofocus when you depress the shutter button here halfway. So you just push it down like that. It'll hunt and focus, and then when you push the shutter the entire way, it'll go ahead and take a picture. So I'll go ahead and take a picture of my cameraman Justin over here behind me now. And by default, it will go ahead and replay your picture for you if you have this articulating screen out. By the way, you can flip this around to protect the screen so it doesn't get scratched up while you travel. Then flip it out back here. I love these articulating screens. It's also great. You can tilt it down like this and then shoot over a crowd by holding it over your head, or shoot low. I'll show you how to use live view in just a minute. If you take a picture and you want to look at it again, go ahead and hit the play button right here above the dial. So I'll hit that and you see I can look at my picture. This camera has a touch screen, which is fantastic, which means I can just pull apart like that and zoom in just to make sure the eyes are nice and sharp. This also allows you to switch between pictures by swiping. So I can, oh, look, I was shooting my daughter's soccer game. If you want to see some more information about the picture, hit the info button here. Each time you push the info button, it will show you some different information. So here you can see it's showing me my camera settings, 1/125th, f/5.6, ISO 6400. Push it again and I can see that oh so important histogram. If you're not sure how to use the histogram, this chart here, check chapter 4 in my book, Stunning Digital Photography. I'll be referencing that a lot because I'm not going to try to teach you all aspects of photography today. I'm teaching you how to use the camera, but the mechanics of the camera are kind of the easy part. Actually learning how to get a great picture, how to get great lighting, mood, composition, etc. You'll have to rely on Stunning Digital Photography for that. Let's go ahead and talk about using Aperture Priority mode. And this is the mode that I use most of the time when I'm taking just casual pictures. Aperture Priority mode, which you can select by using the mode dial here. You have to push the center button in here in order to change the mode dial. It stops you from accidentally turning it. So push this in and then turn it over to AV. By default, your camera probably comes set to the little green auto icon there. And now that you know how to use the other modes, you never have to go back to the green icon. I'm going to show you enough that you won't have to use that again. But if you hand your camera to somebody else, somebody who's not a skilled photographer, go ahead and switch it back to the green mode. That'll just reset it to, not permanently reset it, but temporarily reset all the customized settings that you've made. It'll make it work much more intuitively than it might in your more advanced modes. But us, we're advanced, right? So I'm going to switch over to Aperture Priority mode, push the center button in, twist it over to AV. I don't know why they say AV. It stands for Aperture Priority. Now, as I turn this on, we can look at the back screen here to see our current settings. Now when I twist the main dial here next to the shutter, I'm adjusting the aperture. So here we can see it's set to f/5.6. As I twist it to the right, that f number gets higher and higher. Now if you're confused about what f-stop numbers mean, don't worry, I describe it in chapter 4 of Stunning Digital Photography, so once you get there, it'll all make perfect sense. In a nutshell, the aperture is the opening in the lens, and as it gets smaller, it lets less and less light in. However, smaller apertures are related to higher f-stop numbers. So actual small opening, high f-stop number. High f-stop numbers mean high background sharpness. So if you've seen pictures where the background is blurred nicely, like in a portrait, that means the photographer was shooting with a low f-stop number, like f1.8. If the background was nice and crisp, it was probably a high f-stop number, like f22. So this is a very important part of controlling how your pictures look, and you can do it just with a flick of the finger when you're in Aperture Priority mode. Another way to change the settings on this camera is to hit the Q button here. Hit the Q button, and now you can just touch part of the screen that you want to change. And then, again, use the main dial. Now, you obviously don't need to do that in Aperture Priority mode. I just wanted to show you that you can always interact with the camera using the touch screen and the Q button. It just, if you ever get flustered and you forget where things are, that's a really easy way to do it. So now let's jump into Shutter Priority mode, my second most popular, my second favorite mode. Shutter Priority mode allows you to control the shutter speed on the camera, how long that shutter is open. Most of the time when you take a picture, you don't think about the shutter speed. It just seems to happen in an instant, like ding, but it's not really an instant. It happens over a period of time. If you're taking a night photography shot, you might keep the shutter open for a full 30 seconds. 1/60th is probably okay for most photography, but if you're out shooting sports, you probably want to be at 1/250th of a second for little kids, or for bigger kids, high school, pro football, you might be at 1/1000th or even 1/2000th of a second. For things like flying birds, you want to be at 1/1500th of a second to 1/2500th of a second, depending on the size of the bird, how much it's flapping its wings. And for things like hummingbirds, where the wings are flapping really fast, you want to go just as high as you can, 1/4000th of a second. So Shutter Priority mode allows you to choose that shutter speed, and then the camera adjusts the other settings to get you a well-exposed shot. To select Shutter Priority mode, push this center button in here in the mode dial, and then twist it over to TV. TV like timing mode. Now, this main dial here, instead of adjusting the f-stop, it's going to adjust the shutter speed. You can see it right there. It's at 1/125th. Going left gives me a slower and slower shutter speed. Here I am all the way at 1 full second. As I push the shutter, You can see it stays open for a long, long time. Pull it to the right to get faster and faster shutter speeds, all the way up to the maximum of 1/4000th of a second. Now, why would you not just pick 1/4000th of a second all the time? That would eliminate the possibility that somebody's face would be blurred because they were moving, or your camera would shake and make the whole picture blurry. The faster shutter speeds let in less light because the shutter's just not open as long. When you let in less light, the camera has to use a higher and higher ISO. And we'll cover that in a little bit. But ISO, a higher ISO, will make your pictures much noisier. So you always want to use the slowest shutter speed you can that is fast enough to eliminate any camera shake and unwanted motion blur. More information about that in Chapter 4 of Stunning Digital Photography. Now let's talk about manual mode. Sounds really scary, right? And everybody always thinks like all the pros use manual mode, but really, I don't often use manual mode. Anytime in the studio, I have to use manual mode with the studio lights. But most of the time, I'm in one of the auto exposure modes, Aperture or Shutter Priority. But if you're ready for manual mode, push this button in here and then twist it around to the M there. M is for manual mode. And now, this main dial here adjusts the shutter speed, just like it does in Shutter Priority mode. But you can also control the aperture. So I can adjust the aperture here using the back dial. So now I can control both the shutter speed and aperture. This doesn't mean that the camera won't perform auto exposure. If you have auto ISO enabled, ISO adjusts the sensitivity of the sensor, then the camera will still auto expose your pictures. If you want complete control over the camera, you'll have to manually set the ISO to, and I'll show you that in just 1 second. Bulb mode is something that we cover in the night photography chapter of Stunning Digital Photography. Bulb mode allows you to keep the shutter open for longer than 30 seconds. In fact, you can keep it open for as long as you hold your finger on the shutter button. To use bulb mode, put your camera into manual mode, and then use the main dial here and twist the shutter speed slower and slower and slower, past 5 seconds, 10 seconds. Once you get to 30 seconds, give it one more click, and it will go into bulb mode. I'll show you how bulb mode works. As I put my finger on the shutter here, it opened the shutter, and it's keeping it open as long as I have my finger pushed down on that. As soon as I let go, it closes the shutter and shows me my picture. So you could use that technique to take a 10-minute picture, a nice time lapse perhaps. All you'd have to do is hold your finger on the shutter button for 10 minutes. That would probably get boring, right? And in fact, if you tried to keep your finger here, you'd probably shake the camera around, or maybe you'd slip and it would come off. So people don't really use bulb mode with just their finger on the shutter. What you'll do instead is you'll use a remote shutter release. You'll connect it to this port that I showed you at the beginning and just lock the shutter open. Or you'll use the timer on the remote shutter release to program the timer to keep the shutter open for 10 minutes. There's a video demonstrating how to do this in Chapter 10 of Stunning Digital Photography, which covers night photography. And I'll give a quick plug to my book. The book here on the left, Stunning Digital Photography, teaches you everything about photographic techniques. It's not just figuring out aperture and ISO and shutter speed. I know you think, oh, I've got that worked out. I'm so glad, that seems like a lot. But really, the fun part of photography is the artistic part. Figuring out how to get the right expression from your family members. Figuring out the best way to really capture the moment. It's not as simple as dialing in settings. It's about assessing the scene, finding different angles, using compositional rules like the rule of thirds. So I teach you all of that in Stunning Digital Photography in quite a bit of detail, and I'll teach you how to take great portraits, wildlife pictures, landscapes, cityscapes, night photography, macro photography of insects. I even get into underwater photography. Just about everything you want is in there. If you're into post-processing, Lightroom, we have books covering Lightroom 5 and Lightroom 6 and CC. Take your pick. These both come with 12 hours of video now. And so if you're not the type who's into books, if you prefer learning by videos, if you're a visual learner like this, we've got you covered in these books. You can read when you are in the mood to read, but then they call out 2 separate videos that help to reinforce the points. So you can either just watch the 12 hours of video and never pick up the book, or you can read the book and never watch the videos, but for the best results, read the book and watch the videos as you go. It's a much more thorough and long-term way to learn by learning through multiple different media. That's our belief. My photography buying guide here covers all the lenses and flashes and camera bodies that you might be interested in. So if you're thinking about upgrading that kit lens to something better, if you're thinking about upgrading your camera body, some point. The camera gear is pretty cool. If you're into camera gear, check out my photography buying guide. You can get all of these at Amazon or go to sdp.io/store. The ebooks are under $10. Paperback books are a little bit more, but the paperback books come with a free ebook. These all also come with social networking access, so you can get into our Facebook group, talk to other people who are in the process of learning, get feedback on your pictures. It's our way of providing teacher and peer support, like a classroom environment. Let's talk about the shutter modes a little bit. By default, when you get your camera, it will take one picture. So as I push the shutter, it takes one picture. I release, I can take another picture when I want. But there are multiple different shutter modes that you can access by pushing this directional pad here to the left. So as I push it to the left, I can now browse all the different shutter modes. The one I use almost all the time is continuous shooting here, the second one. So I'll just touch that. And now when I hold the shutter down, well, I still have it in bulb mode. So I'm just gonna change the shutter speed and I'm gonna make it nice and fast at 1/400th of a second. So now when I hold the shutter down, it continually takes photos and pretty fast, right? You could rack up a lot of pictures. This is the mode you'll want for things like sports and wildlife where there are moving subjects where you need to capture a split second and you can't necessarily time it just perfectly. But it's also fine for just snapshots, for just portraits, because you can just take one picture. Just take one picture and remove your finger. So I don't see any reason not to use continuous shutter all the time. There are a couple other important shutter modes, like the S modes here are the silent shooting, and I love these because they just make the camera a little bit quieter. Not silent, but you can see it's a little bit quieter, not bad. It's great if you're at a wedding, for example. I would love it if every guest at every wedding I had to photograph would use some sort of silent mode. They don't. Their camera's always beeping and clanking loudly. So be courteous, turn on that silent mode anytime you don't want to disturb people or wildlife around you. There are also a couple other modes here for self-timers. You'll see a 10-second self-timer and a 2-second self-timer. The 10-second self-timer is for those times when you put your camera on a tripod and you want to run around and like put your arms around your family and be in the picture. That 10 seconds gives you a chance to run around. The 2-second timer is for things like night photography. Anytime you're working on a tripod and you want to get the sharpest picture possible, put on that 2-second timer, and then when you push the shutter, the camera will wait 2 seconds and then take the picture. And what that does is it eliminates the shake that is introduced in your camera just by pushing the shutter button. So just when you push the shutter button, it shakes the camera a little bit. That'll bounce out, and after 2 seconds, your camera will be nice and steady. You'll then be able to get a sharper picture. That's just what the 2-second delay is for. You can also set a timer that takes continuous photos after the timer expires. This last item here, as I move to that and then scroll up or down, you can also use little touch pads. You can touch the screen when you want to. This is even better for those times when you're running around to put your arm around your family, because instead of just taking one photo and then requiring you to run back, it'll go ahead and take 9 photos. And so I've set this to 9. So as I select that, you can see the yellow light blinking. And so after 10 seconds, it's going to take 9 pictures continuously. And you know what that does? The guy who blinks as soon as that first shutter clicks, it's always me. He will probably have his eyes open again by frame 2 or 3. And maybe your kid will put the rabbit ears down. So you take multiple pictures consecutively like that, just so that you can improve the odds of getting a perfect shot in that kind of scenario. Because it's easy to flip through 9 pictures and just pick the best one. There will be a best one. So anytime I'm doing a self-portrait like that, I'll use that continuous shutter. Let's also talk about the focusing modes. When you first get the camera is set to like this intelligent mode, intelligent little quotes, where the camera is going to try to figure out if it's a moving subject or a still subject and then adjust the focusing based on that. You don't need to use that anymore, because now you know how to set up the focusing modes. You'll be able to choose between still subjects and continuous subjects. To set the focusing mode, push this directional pad to the right here where it says AF. And you can see there are 3 different modes here. One-shot mode focuses on your subject and then stops. Once it gets focused, it stops. And then you can recompose the picture. Move it to the side and then finally take your picture. As long as you have your finger halfway on the shutter, after it's focused, it won't refocus. Even if your subject walks towards you, it'll just be out of focus. One-shot mode is very accurate for still subjects, for completely still subjects. Not even like a kid who's wiggling around a little bit, you'd probably want continuous. It also allows you to use focus recompose, which is a technique that I teach in chapter 2 of Stunning Digital Photography, allowing you to recompose the picture with your finger held down on the shutter so that you can focus anywhere, even where there's not a focusing point. But on this particular camera, because it has such a great focusing system, the mode I use basically all the time is continuous mode. So start this back up. I'll select AF here. Continuous is AI servo. This tracks focus. So anytime you've got your finger held halfway down on the shutter, it will look for a subject in focus. And if that person moves towards you, it'll change the focusing and keep that person in focus. If they move away, it'll keep it in focus. If you move your camera to the side so that the focusing point is now on something in the distance, it will automatically refocus. You definitely need to use AI servo for moving subjects, wildlife, sports, kids running around in the playground. But on cameras with a great focusing system, I use it all the time for all subjects. And this camera has a great focusing system. So I would put it in AI servo and then never worry about it again. I also want to talk about how to select the different focusing points, because this camera has a great variety of focusing points that you can choose from. I'll pull up the screen here. The button you're going to use for selecting the focusing points is this button right here. It's got focusing points drawn on it. Push that in, and it displays the focusing points. You can see the same thing by putting your eye to the viewfinder. It displays it in there. And now, if you are in the 1-point AF mode, you can use the directional pad to just scroll around and pick the focusing point that you want. So if you wanted to follow the rule of thirds, you might pick this upper third focusing point. And then just hit the shutter button to begin taking pictures with that focusing point. You can also select how many focusing points are active, and you'll do that by pushing this button here at the top. It has like a little T. It looks like focusing points, but it's shaped like a T. It shows it to you. I'll push the wrong button. It shows it to you right there. So, or you can touch the screen. So as I'm pushing this button, you'll see it switches between the different modes. Zone AF uses multiple autofocus points in a group. So I can choose which group of AF points. This is really useful for moving subjects. If you're focusing on your daughter running towards you in a soccer game and you're using a single focus point, it's possible that you won't keep that focusing point precisely on the subject. You might move it over to the side a little bit, and in that case, the camera would immediately begin focusing on the background, and you'd lose your focus. When you use a group of 9 autofocus points like that, the subject might move from this point to this point, and the camera would continue to track that subject as they moved across those focusing points. The downside of that is occasionally those multiple focus points will cause the camera to focus on something different, some other subject, the background, and that can mean, again, you miss shots. So it's kind of a trade-off. If you can keep your subject, a single point on your subject, then use the 1-point autofocus. It's the most precise, it's the most reliable, because the camera isn't making any decisions. It's only focusing precisely where you tell it. If your subject is moving and you have a plain background, like if you're taking pictures of a bird against a blue sky, the zone AF or the full 19-point AF will work the best. Your camera will come set up pretty much using the 19-point AF, but that means that it might choose to focus on the distant eye instead of the near eye when you're taking a portrait, and you always want to focus on the near eye. So I almost always use a single autofocus point, and I only resort to the multiple focusing points when I'm struggling, when I'm using a big telephoto lens like that guy, and I can't keep that one autofocus point on the subject. Talk about manual focus a little bit. First, some people think like all the pros use manual focus because it's harder. And indeed, manual focus is harder. It's far less precise, especially with modern DSLRs that don't have specialized viewfinders that our film cameras did in the 60s and 70s and 80s. It doesn't have like a ground glass viewfinder. It's not designed for precise manual focusing. But you can manual focus, and there are times when you need to, like when autofocus is failing you, or you need to focus through a chain link fence, for example. The Canons here have a switch right on the lens, so I'll switch it from autofocus to manual focus. And now I can just turn the dial here. Depending on the lens you have, you can probably adjust the manual focus while the lens is still in autofocus mode. They usually have like a clutch mechanism that allows autofocus and manual focus to work simultaneously. So you just look through the viewfinder and adjust the manual focus ring until everything comes into focus. I'll switch that back into AF. Anytime you switch away from autofocus when you're done shooting, I would suggest putting it back in autofocus. Otherwise, you know, your spouse will pick up the camera and it won't focus and they'll think it's broken. Or you'll pick up the camera and you'll miss the shot because you were expecting it to autofocus and it just didn't. So now I'll go on and talk about metering modes a little bit. In stunning digital photography, I discussed metering modes. And I also say you shouldn't worry about it so much because instead I'll teach you to take a sample shot, review the histogram, and adjust your exposure compensation. Metering is the process the camera uses to decide how bright or how dark your picture should be. So it looks through the lens at the scene and just basically decides how bright the scene is. And if the scene is super bright, it'll use a fast shutter speed to get a properly exposed picture. If you're taking a picture at night, it'll say, hey, it's really dark here. I need to use a long shutter speed and a big wide ISO to get a properly exposed picture. So your camera can look at the entire scene, or it can look at a small portion of the scene, or it can look at a tiny portion of the scene, depending on the metering mode. And your camera by default will look at the entire scene. And that's almost always the right choice. To change the metering mode to something else, you'll hit the Q button here, and then scroll down to the middle bottom icon here. Right now it looks like an eye in a box. That's because it's set to evaluated metering, but I'll select that. And now I can choose from 4 different modes. Evaluated metering, like I said, is the scene. It takes the entire scene in. You'll just leave this there and not worry about it if you listen to my advice. Partial metering looks at a smaller circle in the middle of the frame. Spot metering looks at a really small part of the frame. A lot of people will tell you to use spot metering, but it tends to be incredibly unreliable because if you use spot metering and that little dot happens to fall on my brightly colored shirt here because it's so bright, the camera would think, oh, the scene is very bright. I need to expose this. I need to use a fast shutter speed. And what will happen is you'll end up with a really dark, underexposed picture. If in the next frame you happen to drop the spot metering spot on something dark like this camera, the camera would think, oh my goodness, it's night. I need to use a long shutter speed. And what will happen is you'll end up with a bright, overexposed picture. So spot metering was very useful in the film days when you didn't get a chance to review your pictures, and if you got it wrong, you had to wait a couple of days to figure it out, and you probably couldn't go back. So spot metering had its use back in the day, and our cameras still carry that feature because nobody's brave enough to take it away. But for those of us shooting digital, evaluated metering is almost always going to be better. So once again, I'll go back in, I'll hit the Q button here, and just show you there's one other mode, center weighted average, which is very similar to partial metering. It looks in the center of the picture and weights that most heavily, but it does evaluate the whole scene. Again, just wanted to show you where they are. For the most part, you'll be using evaluated metering. Now let's talk about changing ISO. I made a couple of references to ISO because it's very important to exposure. It's one of the 4 parts of exposure: light, of course, shutter speed, aperture, and finally ISO. ISO controls in a sense, the sensitivity of the sensor. So if you use a high ISO, like ISO 6400, your camera can take a well-exposed picture at night with a fast shutter speed. But the pictures will be very, very noisy. If you use a low ISO, like ISO 100, your camera will need a longer shutter speed in all conditions. But in bright light, in daylight, you'll get a nice, clear image with almost no visible noise. So for that reason, you always use the lowest ISO you always can. By default, you don't have to worry about ISO because your camera comes configured to use auto ISO. And you'll probably use auto ISO most of the time. Even as a pro, I often use auto ISO. When you decide you want to manually control the ISO, it's easy. This camera has a button dedicated to it. Right here on top, it says ISO. So you push that, and now you can just scroll and select the ISO you want. It goes all the way up to 12,800. H here is basically ISO 25,600. If you're shooting RAW, selecting H is exactly like selecting ISO 12,800 and then just cranking the exposure up in post. So these higher ISOs will end up with very noisy pictures, but when it's dark out, when you just have no choice, that's what you'll have to use. So again, most of the time you want to be at auto ISO. If for some reason the camera seems to be picking the wrong ISO, you can manually select it, but we cover all this in chapter 4 of Studying Digital Photography. Now let's talk about exposure compensation. Earlier during the discussion of metering, I was telling you you didn't need to worry about the metering so much. And the reason is because exposure compensation in cameras works so well nowadays. I'm going to take a picture of this bright screen here. Turn on live view so you can see it. So as I zoom in here, oh, I still had it set to the timer. See, one thing you got to do when you change like the shutter mode is always reset it when you're done, because otherwise the next time you pick up the camera, you're going to hate yourself for not changing it back. So anytime you change to switch to something unusual, switch it back when you're done. I forgot that. So I'm turning on live view here so I can see the back of the display. And as I take a picture and preview, you can see it's actually a little dark because look at the histogram. The screen there should be white. It should be bright white. And instead you can see it made the screen just gray. So this is a time when you need exposure compensation, especially when a scene has a lot of white in it, like someone standing in the snow. It'll make that snow gray, middle gray. To adjust that, what you'll do is use this dial on the back. So you can see on the display here, it's showing me my exposure compensation, +3 stops, which makes it brighter, or -3 stops, which makes it darker. Right now the marker is right in the middle. So if I want to make it brighter, first I have to make sure the camera's active by pushing the shutter halfway, and then I can twist this dial, and you can see even on the display it's getting brighter and brighter and brighter. As I scroll to the left, you can see it gets darker and darker and darker, all the way to +5 stops or -5 stops. So if I take another picture, you can see this picture is much, much brighter than the previous shot. I'll briefly mention, you can see this is blinking here. Those are called the blinkies. And blinkies show you which parts of the picture are completely overexposed, completely blown out, solid white. So it's warning me that parts of the screen there were overexposed. That's why it's blinking. When you see the blinkies, basically it means you dial in some negative exposure compensation and take the shot again so that you're not overexposing any part of the picture. It's both art and science at the same time. So I cranked this up to +5 stops. Remember, you got to go back and reset it to 0 when you're done so that the next picture you take when you've forgotten about exposure compensation isn't accidentally overexposed. You can also see the exposure compensation when you're looking through the viewfinder. Just easier to film it by using the back of the screen. Now I'll talk about bracketing a little bit. Now that you know how to use exposure compensation, you know you might take a shot at the auto expose settings and then add exposure compensation to make it brighter. The camera can do that automatically. It can take multiple pictures at different exposures. In the film era, this was really important. If you traveled to Yosemite to get the ultimate landscape picture, well, you wouldn't be able to develop your film until you got back. And, so it might be a week or two. And you would hate yourself if you would spend time in the darkroom, developed your picture, only to find out you underexposed the picture, right? So what you would do instead is you would enable bracketing on your camera. So you'd take the shot that you thought was right, and then your camera would automatically take a shot that was brighter and a shot that was darker. Then in the darkroom, you could look at those 3 pictures or 5 pictures or whatever, and pick the one that was best exposed. So basically you were just taking a bunch of shots so that you were sure you got one that was usable. That was in the film era though. Nowadays, we don't have to wait a week to see our picture. We can see it instantly on the back of the camera and make adjustments based on the histogram. So bracketing isn't as important as it used to be. But bracketing is still important for shooting HDR pictures, high dynamic range pictures, which we also cover in Stunning Digital Photography. All the ins and outs. But I do want to show you how to turn on bracketing. It's really easy with this camera, especially once you know the trick. So I'll turn it on and then I'll hit the Q button here. Q. And now I can go up to this dial here. And as I select it, I can use the main dial here to turn on bracketing. So this graph here is an illustration of what pictures the camera is going to take. And the top dial here is showing you the exposure compensation. So this would be taking a darker or brighter picture, just as I just showed you. To take multiple pictures, use the main dial here, and you can see now it's set to take 3 pictures at plus or minus 2 stops. So I'll go ahead and lock that in. I'll hit set there, and you can see again on the back of the screen, you can see it's marking 3 different exposures. I'll take a picture of the back of the screen here, and take another one. That one's dark. Take a third one. This one's bright. So you can see these 3 shots. This is the camera's auto exposure settings. This is an underexposed shot. The second shot is always the underexposed one. And then plus 2 stops of exposure compensation, a brighter shot. So bracketing just tells the camera to take 3 shots, properly exposed, darker, overexposed, so that you can pick the right one in post or blend them for HDR. Again, now that we're done, we want to go back and turn the bracketing off. So I'll turn it back off so I don't screw myself up next time. Now let's talk about using flash and flash exposure compensation. This camera has a built-in flash that you can turn on just by hitting this little lightning bolt icon here. Doop, and it pops up. And now the next time you take a picture, the flash will fire. By default, the camera's pretty smart about the flash. It looks at the scene, figures out how much light it needs to properly expose stuff, and then fires the flash, and will take care of all the settings for you automatically. But it seems like most of the time, the flash blinds people and it washes their faces out by putting out too much light. You have complete control over the output of the flash using flash exposure compensation. So with the flash turned on, you can push the flash button again and it will bring up this display here. And down at the bottom here, you'll see the flash exposure compensation dial. So I'll select that. And now what I can do is dial it back. So -1 stops. A stop is a doubling or a halving of light. So -1 stops means it will put out half as much light through the flash than it thinks it should. If I dial it down to -2, it would be 1/4 the normal light, or I could tell it to put out twice as much light or 4 times as much light. So you have complete control over the output of the flash by using flash exposure compensation. Another way to adjust it is from the Q menu here. I'll hit Q, and you can see this icon right here, lightning bolt and plus or minus. That means flash exposure compensation. I can select it and then just use the main dial to dial it up or down to whatever I need. So it just takes a couple of presses and you'll have it selected. Now the on-camera flash here isn't great. Because the light is so close to the lens, you're going to get a lot of red eye. It's never going to be an appealing light. You'll get much better results if you attach an external flash. And at the end of this video, I have a specific recommendation for an inexpensive flash that will do wonders to improve your flash photography. Those external flashes can also be bounced up to the ceiling, which uses the ceiling as a light source, moving it even farther from the lens and greatly improving the results that you get. Like metering, white balance is something you probably shouldn't think too much about. There's other more important things to worry about. Your camera's auto white balance will work fine, especially if you follow my advice later and set your camera to take RAW pictures instead of JPEG pictures. But if you do want to manually set the white balance, this will change how blue, yellow, or orange your pictures are. Basically, we call blue colors in pictures cool colors, and orange colors warm colors. To understand white balance, you have to understand kind of the nature of light and what our brain does to decide what white is in a room. We always take this for granted, that this is a white table. But while the table is white, the light is not necessarily white. If you go out after sunset and you're lit up by the moon, that is actually sunlight bouncing off the moon. But by the time it gets to you, by the time it passes through the atmosphere, it actually ends up very bluish because it loses the red frequencies of light. If you go out at sunrise when the sun is just coming up, everything feels very warm, right? Not physically warm, but orange and red. That's because a lot of the blue light is being dropped as it passes through the atmosphere. If you drive in an older car that has the old style headlights, those are very orange, but you would probably never notice it when you're driving it until you got in a car that had the newer high intensity lights. Those are much cooler, they're much more blue. So these are all examples of things that are white that are actually slightly different colors. The incandescent bulbs in your house, those are actually a little bit yellow compared to the sun. Anyway, your brain decides that the incandescent lights look white and that the sun looks white, and it kind of tricks you. Your camera does the same thing using auto white balance. So it has an auto white balance feature just like your brain. To manually set the white balance, I'll hit the Q button here. Well, actually, that's one way to do it, but I can also hit the directional pad here. You see it says WB at the top, white balance. I'll select that, and now I can scroll through different settings to choose the conditions that I'm currently shooting in. So again, auto white balance is going to work fine for you. But if you're out in the sun and you want to manually set it, there's a daylight setting. If you're in the shade, it's there. On a cloudy day, there's a setting for it. If you're shooting under tungsten lights or fluorescent lights, tungsten is a pretty good setting for incandescent bulbs too, you might call them. Or using flash, you can also set a custom white balance. Again, my recommendation, auto white balance, and then shoot raw, which I'll show you in just a little bit. Like most settings, you can change that from the Q menu by hitting Q here. You can see that this is white balance, and you can even turn on white balance bracketing if you wanted to take multiple shots at different white balances. And there's this fancy thing here if you get really serious about setting your white balance. But this is something it's probably not worth your time thinking about. This icon here allows you to just get quickly to that. Just in case you forget that WB is there, you can always get to it from the Q menu. Just a quick shortcut. I want to show you the diopter. I'm a glasses wearer. I'm wearing contacts now. If you're a glasses wearer, it's kind of uncomfortable to hold the viewfinder up to your eye and push it against your glasses. So what you can do is you can take your glasses off and adjust your prescription into the diopter here. The diopter is this little twisty dial right next to the viewfinder. So you can twist it up or down. And what you'll do is you'll take your glasses off, you'll look through the viewfinder, and then look at those numbers. Make sure it's lit up. Look at the numbers right below the screen. You know, it says the ISO and the shutter speed and all that. And just twist that diopter until they're as sharp as they can be. Now, even if you're not a glasses wearer, the diopter is important to understand because at some point you're going to accidentally twist that diopter. And then the next time you go to pick up the camera, everything's going to be blurry and you're going to think your camera's not focusing on anything, even though it might actually take a sharp shot and it'll look good on the back of the screen. That's because the diopter got accidentally twisted. So if it seems like everything's blurry in your camera, don't blame your lens, don't send it back to the manufacturer, just put it up to your eye and twist that until everything, all those letters at the bottom of the screen are nice and sharp. Live view is an important feature of this camera and all modern cameras. Live view shows you what you would see in the viewfinder on the back of the camera here. To turn on live view, use this little camera icon here with the red dot. Push that, and now it's showing me in real time the back of the screen. With this camera, because it has an articulating screen, I can flip that out and then hold my camera down low. So I could put it down in the flowers and shoot up at the sun without having to lay on my belly. I could also shoot over a crowd by twisting it down like this and shoot up high. If you go to take those selfies that we were talking about, you can flip it around like this. I could even hold it at arm's length and get a selfie of myself. Live view is really useful. And with this camera in particular, you can focus during live view because it also has a touch screen. So if I focus in the distance here at our studio equipment, I can touch it and it will latch onto the subject and then try to follow that subject. If you're recording sports video, in fact, you could touch the subject that you're filming, like a kid's soccer game, touch your kid's face, and it will track them as they move closer and closer. To see different information in the live view, hit the info button here. You can see you can even display a histogram in real time, which is terribly useful for deciding how much exposure compensation you need before you actually take the picture. So here I can see if I'm looking at the histogram because everything's crammed to the left, the picture's dark. I'm going to want to make sure that entire histogram is used, that something's in that right quarter of the histogram, technique called exposing to the right that I discussed in the night photography chapter of Stunning Digital Photography. So now from looking at the histogram, I know the picture is well exposed and I can take a picture. Live view is tremendously useful for that. Another thing live view is useful for is precisely focusing, say, landscapes or other types of still life. We talked about manual focus earlier, but I'll switch this over into manual focus. And I warned you that manual focus was not very accurate with any DSLR because of the way the viewfinder is. But it can be useful in live view because you can, I'll get it approximately in focus, and now I can magnify the display pushing the magnification button here in the upper right. So I'll push that in a few times and zoom right into those letters. And now that I'm zoomed in really close and tight, I know that I can focus very precisely. Look, now I can see all the little dots in it. So to do this precise focusing technique, turn on live view, then use the magnification buttons to zoom right in, and then manually focus until it's just as sharp as possible. Then you can take your picture. Even though you're looking at the magnified view in live view, it will capture the entire scene, not just what you saw there. Video is closely related to live view. This camera has a special video mode. Right here on the on-off switch, just switch it all the way to the right. And you can see what it's done here is it's cropped it. Whereas in just regular live view, it was showing me the perspective of the full photo. You'll see when I switch, it's going to crop the top and bottom. It's because it's cropping to 16:9. You can take still photos in video mode, but it will crop them to 16:9. So when you're reviewing in live view, in video mode here, you can start recording by pushing the record button, the live view button here, and now it will start filming. It's a pretty good video camera, an HD video camera, and it focuses really well even while it's recording. And now you can see the camera will try to keep up with focusing automatically. This camera has a nice feature called Servo AF, which isn't working so nicely at the moment. There we go. To turn Servo AF on or off, just touch the touchscreen here. When the green light is on, it's trying to focus on whatever comes into frame, like that. If you don't want it focusing, if it's annoying you by the way it's focusing, just touch that to turn it off. Basically, if you're filming a still subject, you would focus before you started recording and then hit record, and you'd want to turn off Servo AF because sometimes it will just randomly start to search, to hunt, to look for something to focus on, and that would be distracting on a still subject. So you would turn off Servo AF for still subjects, turn it on for sports or anytime somebody is moving. There are a few settings related to, stop recording here, and show, related to video. As we go into the 4th and 5th menus here, you can see there's an AF mode here. The face tracking is good. It will look for faces in the frame and try to focus on those, and that's usually what you want. But you can choose Flexi Zone AF to specify a focusing point other than a face. So I'll hit the menu button here to back up. Movie Servo AF, I showed you how to turn that on and off from the recording screen, but you can also change it from the menu. If you have AF with the shutter button, the little picture means the shutter button, as you push that, it will start to focus even if you don't touch the screen. You can choose to display a grid, and there's also an option here on the second page of the movie settings here to change the recording size. So by default, this is probably what you want, but it will record 1080p at 30 frames a second. It called it 29.97 frames a second, a little more precise. And it will record for up to half an hour. It will not record for more than half an hour. So if you're recording your kid's hour-long concert, make a note, go back and between songs, stop it and restart it, or wait half an hour and just be sure you're there so that you can restart it because it will shut off after half an hour. 1920 by 1080 at 30 frames a second is the best quality. If you want a faster frame rate, if you want to go to 60 frames a second, you'll have to drop down to 720p. There are a few other options here that you probably won't ever need. At the top here, standard, that's the best quality video. You can also go down to light, which will record smaller file sizes, but with lower quality. So nowadays storage is fairly cheap, and most of us are just going to use 1920 by 1080 at 30 frames a second. The digital zoom allows you to zoom in further if you're going to crop anyway. So if you can't get close enough to your subject for things like wildlife, the digital zoom can be useful. You can see you can adjust it up or down using these controls. So now it's zooming in further and further, and it will still record that at 1080p. And you might not even see a quality degradation. It's not like the old school camcorders that had digital zoom. It's using a smaller and smaller part of the sensor, but still capturing full 1080. So it gives you pretty good quality for those times when you need to, film something far away like a bird. I'll turn that back off before I forget. By default, sound recording is set to auto, and that's fine. But if you hook up an external mic, you'll want to change this to manual and then adjust the levels up or down here so that the levels are not peaking. But if you're just using the internal recorder and you're recording something casual, you can use auto. The challenge with auto is that it will adjust the volume up or down depending on how loud people are talking, how much noise there is. So what will happen is somebody will be talking and it will adjust the volume for the voice, but then they'll wait for a second and stop talking, and then it will hear silence and it will crank up the volume and pick up all these like ambient sounds and rustling and stuff. And then as soon as they talk, it will drop the volume back down because now there's more noise. So auto can be a little annoying to listen to. Manual, even with the internal recorder, is generally a better option. I think that does it for the actual video settings. Now let's talk about formatting a memory card. Your memory card in here is your digital film, and your memory card, no matter how big it is, will eventually fill up when you take enough pictures. So what I like to do is to put that memory card in my computer, copy all the pictures to my computer, back those pictures up safely, and then format my memory card to clear space so that I can reuse it. To format your memory card, hit the menu button here, and then over on one of the last settings here, on the first wrench page, scroll down to Format Card and select that. And now it's going to warn you that you're going to lose all of your pictures, which is scary and appropriately so. It will erase your pictures once you select OK there. I don't want to erase these pictures yet, but it will also recapture all the space so that you can reuse the card. If you or your kid accidentally format your card, look up a tool called QPhotoRec. You can use it to recover your photos. If you get my Lightroom book, I have a whole video in there showing you how to use QPhotoRec to recover your photos in the event that they're lost. I want to talk about how I set up the T6s, how I recommend you set it up. This can definitely improve your photography, make taking pictures much faster, and just help you get the shot. First thing I want everybody to do is to disable that beep. Maybe it's the wedding photographer in me, because when you're shooting a wedding and everything's quiet and peaceful and people are saying their vows, the last thing you want to hear is somebody's camera going beep, beep, beep. It'll beep like when it acquires focus, but you can see in the viewfinder that it's in focus. You don't need the beeping. Hit the menu button and go over to the first page here. Beep is the second option. That's how important it is. They wanted you to find it. It's set to enabled by default. Set it to disable, and then it won't beep anymore. Thanks. The whole world thanks you for turning off the beeping. I also want to show you how to shoot RAW. How important is this? It's the very first option even before beep. So by default, you'll see it set to L, and that little line thing. L means it's shooting JPEG. You can shoot different versions of JPEG, though I don't know why you'd ever want to shoot anything but large JPEG files. But if you select RAW, the last option here, you can get better image quality out of your camera, and you'll have a lot more latitude for correcting your mistakes in post. So if you import your pictures into a free tool like Picasa or a paid tool like Adobe Lightroom, you can adjust the exposure after you take the picture back at your computer. You can bring the exposure down a full 2 stops and not notice any problems. Or you can raise it up multiple stops, like 3 or 4 stops even. This can make your pictures look much better. Using RAW also allows you to recover shadows that, when there's a black part of the picture where somebody's face might be in shadow, you can recover those shadows and really improve the look of the picture. If the clouds are blown out and you want to show those details in the clouds, with a RAW file, you could just recover the highlights and show that detail in there. RAW is really amazing, and even if you don't know how to do any post-processing now, years from now, you might. Or maybe your kids will want to go through your pictures in the future and they'll know how to do that sort of post-processing. Turning on RAW now uses more storage space. You won't get as many pictures on your card, but you can still get thousands of pictures on an average card. And it gives you the option to do more serious post-processing later. I use RAW anytime I'm not taking hundreds of pictures. If I'm going to shoot my kid's soccer game, I know I'm going to be rattling off as many pictures as I can, and I'll shoot JPEG for that. If I'm shooting a flying bird with this particular camera, I would probably set it to large JPEG files. But for landscapes, for casual photography, my default is RAW so that I can get better image quality out of it. I also want to show you how to use back button focus. By default, when you get the camera, you focus by depressing the shutter button halfway. It focuses and then stops. There's a technique described in Chapter 4 of Studying Digital Photography called back button focus that can allow you to instantly focus whenever you want to on a moving subject or a still subject and still allow you to use focus recompose without changing any camera settings. It's terribly useful for just about everything, especially night photography, especially sports, especially wildlife, especially chasing kids, macro photography. I love back button focus. Check chapter 4 for detailed information. For now, I'm just going to show you how to do it. I'll set this back to regular stills mode. Open up the menu by pushing menu here, and then I'm going to go over to the custom functions. On the last wrench icon here, the second item down is custom functions. We want to find custom function 10. So for custom function 10, set it to option 1, AE lock/AF. You can see the description says shutter /AE lock button. This is the shutter button, and this is the AE lock button with the asterisk on it. So we're saying make the shutter do the auto exposure lock, just lock in the exposure when I depress the shutter halfway, and make the AE lock button, this button here, drive the autofocus motor. So once I select that, now when I push the shutter button halfway, it doesn't autofocus. I'll turn on live view just so you can see it. So now as I push the shutter button halfway, it's not trying to autofocus. When I push this button on the back here, suddenly it tries to autofocus. So what you've done is you've decoupled focusing from the shutter button. It's on a separate button, giving you complete control over when the camera focuses and when it doesn't. That way, it just doesn't autofocus for you when you're just trying to take a picture without changing the focusing. One last thing, I want to show you how to use My Menu. There's an awful lot of menu options here in this camera. You dig through all these different settings, but you'll be revisiting a few of them over and over again. My Menu is perfect for this. It's your own custom menu. The very last icon here with the star. Select My Menu settings, and now I can just manage the menu or add my own custom menu items to it. So the first option here will let me add an item, register to My Menu. I'll select that, and now you can see all these different menu items from all the different menus. I'll pick whichever one I want to use the most. Touch shutter, for example. Click OK. And now, let's go back here. Now you can see touch shutter is on My Menu. So the things I usually have on My Menu are like formatting the memory card. That's something I do a lot. Where is formatting? You'd think this might be sorted in alphabetical order, but it's not. There we go, format card. So I'll register format card. Use the Wi-Fi and NFC settings in there. So now, anytime I want to find format card, I can just go to My Menu and it's there, and I don't have to remember, is it on wrench 1 or wrench 2 or wrench 3 or wrench 4. Just whatever you use the most, stick it under My Menu so you can find it quickly. Now that you know how to use the basics of the camera, I want to recommend some gear for you, because so many people will get that first kit lens, but maybe they'll find it lacking, maybe it doesn't have enough reach, maybe it doesn't work that great in low light. Here's some other options. Especially for low light, the Canon 50mm f1.8 is a fantastic choice. You can pick this up for about $100, which is unbelievably inexpensive for a lens. Buy it used or new. They hold up pretty well, so used copy works just fine. This lens is remarkable because it's an f1.8 lens. That's a huge iris, a really big iris. This kit lens is f5.6, so this lens gathers like 4 times more light, 8 times more light. I'm not going to try to math it right now. It gathers way more light. That means for things like basketball, soccer, indoor volleyball, indoor sports, especially where it's kind of dim and you're shooting action, this lens will let you take cleaner pictures, and you'll get much better results out of it. It's also a great first portrait lens because it will let you blur the background just beautifully, and all that for $100. Everyone should pick up one of those. They're cheap. If you've got a little bit bigger of a budget and you want sharper pictures, I recommend the Sigma 18-35 f1.8 zoom. This is an expensive lens, $800. You can find them used for about $700. They hold up just fantastically. But this is a pro lens. This is a professional grade lens. You can use it in low light, and it is sharper than even primes like that. I'll let you in on news that's a little bit depressing. The kit lens that you got with your camera has a resolution, it will only show about 9 megapixels. Even though your camera has a 24 megapixel sensor, the sensor is capable of 24 megapixels. The lens itself is only transmitting about 9 megapixels of data because it's an inexpensive lens. Most people are happy with that level of sharpness, but some people come to me and they're like, I want my pictures razor sharp. I want them as sharp as they can be. This lens is the answer. It's expensive. It's exceptionally sharp though. You will see over twice as much detail. You'll get closer to the full 24 megapixels that the sensor is capable of receiving. There are links down at the bottom of these pages. This one is stp.io/s35. If you use that link, I get a few pennies out of every dollar just to kind of thank me for the recommendation. You can buy it from Amazon. Another lens I recommend for portraits when you're ready to step up from the 50mm f1.8 is the Sigma 50-150 f2.8, the newer version of that lens, because they had a couple of different versions. You can get it at stp.io/s150. This lens is sharper than the 70-200 f2.8 lenses that everybody uses. Why? Because it's designed for the APS-C sensor in your camera. We have the Canon 70-200 f2.8, which costs like $2,200, and it's a great lens. But this $650 used lens, they don't make them anymore, unfortunately, you have to grab it used, is sharper on these APS-C cameras, noticeably so, and it's a third of the price. So how can you go wrong? This is a better choice. Almost everybody just buys the expensive 70-200 f2.8s. Get this instead. It's also the perfect choice for any sort of sports at more of a distance than you could get by with the 50mm. So things like outdoor soccer, baseball, football. If you get into wildlife, the Canon system has a fantastic lens that should be everybody's first serious wildlife lens, the 400mm f5.6, which I have camoed up here. I use it all the time. Connecting it to the T6s is fantastic because that 24 megapixel sensor captures so much detail and the focusing works just great. This lens is new at about $1,350, but pick up a used copy because you can get them for around $1,000, and they're like made out of solid metal. They're built like a tank. I bought this one used and I've had it for, I don't know, 6 or 7 years and it's still holding up perfectly. It's a solid chunk of metal and it captures professional levels of detail. You will not get that much detail out of your 70-200 or 75-300 lens. It captures extremely intense detail, better than just about any zoom out there, certainly any zoom under $2,000. I also want to suggest a flash because a lot of people go and buy one of those Canon flashes, which are wildly overpriced. I'm going to suggest a third-party flash from a company called Yongno. This is the YN568EX2. It supports all the features of the top-end Canon flashes that cost like $600. It's $125. We have several. We use them for weddings and stuff, professional stuff. They work fantastically. They have a great user interface, and your camera doesn't know the difference between it and a Canon lens. Check it out at stp.io/YN568EX2. I also want to suggest a tripod. Tripod's one of the first things you should buy. You need it for night photography, but you also will find it very useful for things like landscapes and self-portraits. It's great for getting the sharpest possible pictures. You'll need it for macro photography too. The tripod I suggest people start with is the Dolica GX600B200. The name really rolls off the tongue, right? Anyway, it's a $50 tripod. So it's not, you can spend $800 on a tripod. This is a great starter tripod. It's got a hook there on the center column so you can hang your bag from it and make it even more sturdy. It's light enough to travel with and you won't mind it so much on a hike. Even if you outgrow this tripod, and you get a more expensive like carbon fiber tripod or something, you'll still find yourself using this for travel and other types of photography. It's just a great tripod. You can't go wrong with it. stp.io/tripod1. One last plug for our 3 books. Photographic Techniques, More Than Camera Settings, teach you the art and science of photography, how to get great pictures. And if you're not happy with any of these books, I'll just give you your money back. Just send me a note, tony@northrop.org. If you want to learn Lightroom and post-processing, check out my book, Lightroom 5. All these books come with tons of videos, so you're clearly good at learning from videos. I understand that. I mix in videos and books, so you can learn just by watching the videos, or read the books and watch the videos together for the best results. More information about cameras, lenses, lots more recommendations in my photography buying guide. Ebooks are all under $10, or you can get paperbacks too for more. Visit stp.io/store. We ship worldwide, or just visit Amazon, because most Amazon outlets will have all these books. Just search for Tony Northrop. Thanks so much. If you have any questions, add a comment down below, and I hope you'll subscribe to see more videos from us, because we release 3 new videos every single week. So click subscribe to catch up. Thanks.